I don't think she's going to have the greatest social life in common. Look, nothing. Don't go. Wait a minute, Freddie. Wait a minute.
For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the king of late night, sitting down with over 22,000 guests. He was the unflappable host who could handle anything. But here's the catch. Behind the scenes, Carson had a secret list. Producers revealed that 9 of those guests were so disturbing, so creepy, or so out of control that Hollywood and Carson's own team never wanted them back on that famous couch. We're about to reveal who they were and the shocking #1 guest who left Carson feeling like he was interviewing a ghost. When the guests were a threat. What most people don't realize is that The Tonight Show was a tightly controlled machine. But sometimes a guest would show up and throw a wrench into the whole thing. First on the list, Truman Capote. Yeah, about that. Truman Capote was one of America's most celebrated authors, writing in Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was a talk show favorite, but as Capote's personal struggles got worse, his appearances took a dark turn. A director who worked on the show explained, Capote in his later years had this quality that Johnny found deeply unnerving. He would speak in this wispy, barely audible voice, trailing off mid-sentence, then suddenly continue as if no time had passed. Get this, Johnny apparently said it was like trying to interview a ghost who kept fading in and out of our dimension. During one infamous appearance in 1975, Capote arrived visibly intoxicated. He just launched into these rambling, disconnected monologues about passing away and paranormal experiences. This wasn't the witty guest Carson was expecting. You could feel the tension in the studio. The interview got so incoherent that producers made the rare call to cut it short. During the commercial break, Carson reportedly turned to his producer and said Capote sounded like a haunted house whispering its own memoir. When the show came back, Carson just announced Capote wasn't feeling well and moved on. What really disturbed Carson was the mix of Capote's physical weakness and the dark things he was rambling about. A writer who was there recalled Capote telling half-coherent stories about people who had passed away mysteriously, then giggling softly. Carson kept his professional face on, but his team could see he was disturbed. An associate said, after the show, Johnny said, "I don't mind difficult guests, but that was like interviewing someone who's halfway into the afterlife already. He was genuinely creeped out." But if Capote was a fading ghost, the next guest was an explosion. Klaus Kinski. The German actor was famous for his intense, wild performances. His volcanic temper was legendary. When Kinski appeared in the late 70s, Carson met a level of manic intensity that left him worried for everyone's safety. From the moment Kinski walked on stage, there was this crackling, dangerous energy, remembered a stage manager. He had these wild, bulging eyes. Johnny, who normally leaned toward guests, was actually leaning away from Kinski. What made this so unsettling was the total disconnect. Carson would ask a question about his new film, and Kinski would launch into a raving speech about art, religion, and the end of the world. When Carson tried to crack a joke, Kinski fixed him with a stare so hostile the audience literally gasped. "We had security staff on high alert that night," revealed a producer. "We weren't sure if he'd finish the interview or flip the desk." Crew members said Carson later admitted it was the only time he seriously wondered if a guest might get physically violent on air. Ed McMahon, Carson's famous sidekick, recalled Johnny saying, "I wasn't conducting an interview so much as trying to prevent a public meltdown." I've never been so relieved to go to commercial. The Kinski appearance became a legend among the staff. And then there was Robert Blake. Blake was a respected actor from the popular TV show Beretta. He seemed like a great guest. What Carson didn't expect was the wave of pure, cold hostility Blake brought with him. Blake came on with this inexplicable antagonism, explained a writer. It wasn't just that he was difficult, it was the cold, dead-eyed stare he fixed on Carson. There was something genuinely unnerving about it. From the second Blake sat down, the air in the studio went cold. Instead of the usual friendly chat, Blake gave short, sarcastic answers. When Carson tried to use humor, Blake would just stare silently for way too long. The creepy part wasn't just the anger, it was the contrast. Blake was totally still, barely moving, barely blinking. He just stared at Johnny with these dead eyes. Carson, ever the pro, kept his composure, but his team saw the signs. A tighter smile and sitting in a way that put the most space possible between him and Blake. A producer revealed what Carson said after. Johnny told me he felt like he was being studied. He said, "I don't mind if someone doesn't like me, but Blake was observing me like a specimen. I felt like I was being sized up by a predator." The experience was so unsettling that Carson made sure Blake was never booked again. But as bad as a hostile guest was, it was nothing compared to total, intentional chaos. The Chaos Agents. Carson could handle a lot. But the one thing that truly baffled him was when a guest's entire goal was to destroy the show. Enter Andy Kaufman as Tony Clifton. Andy Kaufman was already known for his bizarre comedy. Carson actually liked Kaufman as himself. But when Kaufman showed up as his alter ego, the obnoxious lounge singer Tony Clifton, it created a level of discomfort that rattled even Carson. The Tony Clifton appearance was unique because it was intentionally designed to be disturbing, explained a producer. Most uncomfortable guests are accidentally difficult. Kaufman was deliberately creating an unsettling atmosphere. The problem was it went beyond performance into something genuinely creepy. Clifton arrived on set already in character, ill-fitting tuxedo, bad wig, and acting like a jerk to the staff. From the moment he sat down, he broke every single unwritten rule. He interrupted Carson, insulted Ed McMahon, and made crude remarks. The segment hit its breaking point when Clifton, unhappy with the band, threw a glass of water toward musical director Doc Severinsen. And that's when it happened. Carson, in an almost unheard-of move, walked off his own set. He just got up and left. Johnny never walked off. That's how disturbed he was, said a stage manager. When he left, Clifton actually got worse. Security had to physically remove him. It was like watching someone have a psychotic break, except you knew it was an act. When Carson came back, he was visibly tense. He later said what bothered him most wasn't the obnoxious behavior, but the total commitment to chaos. Kaufman himself was invited back, but Carson permanently banned the Tony Clifton character, but Clifton was an act. The next guest was just offensive. George Jessel. Jessel was an old-school vaudeville performer from the early 20th century. By the time he appeared in the early 1970s, he was a relic from a forgotten era. So, here's the deal. Carson was blindsided. Jessel came from an era where racial and ethnic jokes were standard, explained a writer, but by the 1970s, those kinds of jokes weren't just unfunny, they were appalling. Carson invited Jessel to share some stories. Instead, Jessel launched into what a crew member called a greatest hits of the most offensive material imaginable. The studio went completely silent, recalled a camera operator. Not uncomfortable silence, horrified silence. Johnny's face froze in this pained smile. What made it so creepy was that Jessel had no idea. He was completely oblivious. Carson was trapped. He cut to a commercial way earlier than planned. When the show returned, Jessel was gone. Backstage, Carson was furious. He told his producer, "That is not what this show is about. That kind of thing is never happening again on my watch." Jessel was permanently banned. And then there was Divine. Divine was the drag performer and star of John Waters' shocking underground films. When Divine was booked in the mid-70s, it was a huge deal. This was long before drag was mainstream. A talent coordinator said, having Divine on a mainstream network talk show was genuinely shocking for the era. Johnny was clearly out of his comfort zone. What's interesting here is that Divine wasn't aggressive or rude. The problem for Carson was the deliberate challenge to gender norms. It created this palpable tension. Carson remained courteous but was visibly unsettled, a director recalled. He kept a slightly greater physical distance. His laugh was more nervous than genuine. You could tell he was struggling. He never quite figured it out. When the interview ended, Carson's relief was obvious. A producer recalled him saying, "Well, that was certainly something different for the folks in Omaha tonight." It was his polite way of saying he'd been completely thrown off balance. But some guests were unsettling for far more personal and tragic reasons. Weird vibes. This last group of guests wasn't necessarily hostile or chaotic in the way a drunken brawler or a preening diva might be. These were the nights that tested the very limits of his famous composure. First, a truly strange one, Vincent Price. But here's the catch. Vincent Price was actually a frequent and welcome guest. Carson clearly enjoyed his company. Price was a legend. the undisputed star of classic Gothic horror films, but he was also known to be a witty, urbane, and highly intelligent art collector and gourmet chef. He was, by all accounts, the perfect guest. So why is he on this list? Because even though Carson liked him, crew members noticed that Johnny seemed genuinely unnerved by him. It was precisely that contrast between the polite, intellectual man and the dark persona that made it so effective. Price could be discussing a Renaissance painting or a recipe for fish, and then, without warning, he would suddenly slip into that deep, ominous House of Usher voice. The transition was seamless and it chilled the air. When he did that, you could see Johnny physically recoil, a cameraman recalled. It wasn't a joke recoil, it was an involuntary flinch. For a host who was the master of control, this loss of composure was telling. Price, a born showman, loved to play up his spooky persona. He knew the effect he had. During one segment, Price was describing an intense scene from one of his films. To illustrate his point, he suddenly leaned forward and grabbed Carson's wrist across the desk. Johnny literally jumped in his chair, a genuine spark of panic in his eyes before he covered it with a nervous laugh. He joked afterward, "For a second there, I thought Vincent was actually going to bite me." He was a guest Carson loved having, but who always kept him and the entire studio on the very edge of their seats. But the next guest was a different and far darker kind of unsettling. This one was just heartbreakingly sad. Margot Hemingway. In the late 70s, she was one of the biggest models in the world, the face of an era. Glamorous, charming, and the heir to a legendary name, her first appearances on the show were great, bubbly, full of life, and witty. But her final appearance in the early 80s was an unmitigated disaster. Hemingway came on, but it was immediately clear something was very wrong, recalled a producer. She was disoriented, her speech was erratic, and her eyes had this vacant, glassy quality. The producer added, "Johnny, who could handle anything, just looked genuinely concerned. The humor drained from his face." What made this so awful was her profound, painful disconnection from reality. This wasn't a guest being difficult. This was a human being unraveling in front of millions. She would start to answer a question, then just trail off, her eyes drifting to a point somewhere over Carson's shoulder. The silence would stretch out for long, agonizing moments, an eternity in live television. Other times, she'd suddenly blurt out answers to questions Carson hadn't even asked, as if she were in a completely different conversation. Carson kept trying to find solid ground, to throw her a lifeline, said a staff writer. He'd ask a simple, easy question like, "How is your family?" And Hemingway would answer with these rambling, disjointed statements about, well, nothing that made sense. You could see Johnny becoming increasingly concerned, his professional host mask slipping, revealing a man who was just plain worried for her as a person. The audience fell silent. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was the sound of over 300 people feeling deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. It was the sound of a public spectacle turning into a private tragedy. Afterward, in the green room, when someone tried to lighten the mood with a joke, Carson shut them down. He said that wasn't someone being difficult. That was someone in trouble. He was visibly disturbed, not by her, but by her palpable suffering. And finally, the strangest of them all. The ghost at the feast, Andy Warhol. His appearance in the early 80s might be the most conceptually unsettling interview Carson ever conducted. It wasn't volatile like a fight, it wasn't tragic like Hemingway, it was nothing, a deliberate, unnerving, passive void. Warhol's appearance was more performance art than interview, explained a producer. It was his thing. He barely spoke, gave one-word answers, and stared blankly through Carson as if he wasn't there. Here was Carson, the king of mainstream, the polished, tailored icon of American living rooms, sitting opposite the pale, silver-wigged icon of the counterculture. Carson would ask a thoughtful, long, engaging question. Warhol, in his quiet, breathy voice, would respond with yes or no or uh-huh. Then, just long, unblinking silence. The silence became the main guest. So, who do you think was the worst guest? And does a celebrity owe it to the audience to be on all the time? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.